My name is Tony Ingraffea. I'm a professor, an older professor of engineering from Cornell University, and I'm the MC for this event. I'm going to have a few introductory remarks. I'm then going to introduce the two main speakers for the event, and then I'll manage the Q&A, the very active and exciting Q&A we're going to have after both presentations are completed. As I'm making these remarks, on this screen you're seeing a set of what I call the methane vignettes. You're seeing them and hearing them. These are outtakes from videos taken by private citizens who travel all over New York and Pennsylvania, taking video, sometimes infrared video, of actual events of leaking and purposeful venting of methane directly into the atmosphere. We're holding this event today on the second anniversary of a very significant event in New York State. 2 years ago, almost to the day, New York State decided to ban the development of shale gas in our state. And yet we find ourselves, as you're going to hear today, using more shale gas than ever. Events like this are happening with more frequency in our state and in Pennsylvania, from which we're demanding, New York State is demanding more and more shale gas. And so at this point, some of you might be wondering, I'm looking around the room, very few are wondering, so what's the matter with methane? Isn't it a clean bridge to a renewable future? Well, the answer to those questions is going to be given by my colleague from Cornell University, Bob Howarth, a scientist and the principal author of a number of very important papers on the intersection of methane and climate change and the environment. The paper that we co-authored in 2011, I think it's safe to say, opened the floodgates to scientific inquiry into that very question. And so now we have undoubtedly in the literature proof that methane is not a good bridge fuel. It's not good for anything. The purpose of this workshop, or this press conference, is to let you know that we don't think the politicians are hearing the scientists. So how bad is this problem in New York State? Well, that question is going to be answered by our other speaker, Keith Schue, an engineer, an environmentalist, a technical advisor to Otsego 2000. I think you will agree that while you're listening to Keith, you will be astounded with the facts and figures he's going to give you on what New York State has been doing in the last 2 years with shale gas. And more importantly, he's going to tell you what New York State has not been doing because of its addiction to shale gas. So I'm going to end here. I'm going to let Bob come up and tell you why methane is bad and why methane is not a bridge fuel. And once again, I want to make sure you understand that please hold your questions until both presentations are over. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you all for coming today. The context in which I want to talk about methane and shale gas is the event that happened in Paris literally 1 year ago today. And that's when the United Nations Conference of the Parties 21 came together, and the nations of the world agreed that we need to keep the planet well below 1.5 degrees Celsius in order to keep the risk of catastrophic runaway climate change from getting larger. At 2 degrees Celsius, that risk becomes very, very high. So all of the nations of the world have now agreed to keep the planet well below 2 degrees C, and part of the message is we cannot do that without reducing methane emissions. Now, this is a bit of a complicated slide, but what it's showing is the warming of the planet over the 20th century up to 2011, the squiggly line, that's the real warming. The last decades of the 20th century, the first decades of this century have been warmest. Last year's the warmest ever. This year is going to be a record to be the warmest. You can see that the green reference line there is the rate of warming if we do nothing to control greenhouse gas emissions, and in a period of 6 to 10 to 12 years from now, we'll be at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And again, this is where risk of runaway global warming becomes higher. We'll be hitting 2 degrees in about 25 to 30 years from now if we do nothing with greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a very, very dangerous temperature for the planet. The other three lines on this slide, the next one down there where it says CO2 measures, is what would happen if the world societies were to aggressively control carbon dioxide, but only carbon dioxide. And because of lags in the climate system, we are still going to blow right through the COP21 Paris Accord temperature targets. Controlling CO2 cannot help us stay below those targets. The bottom two lines are what happens if we control methane and other things as well. But methane is the key to that. And since the climate responds much faster to methane, it is the only way we can keep the planet in a safe territory as we move ahead over the coming decades. All right, this concept of bridge fuel, the idea that we continue to use fossil fuels, but we switch out coal, we switch in natural gas, and increasingly natural gas means shale gas, because more and more that's where our natural gas is coming from. There's some logic to this idea of a bridge fuel. And what I'm showing you here is that when you use coal, you produce more carbon dioxide to get the same amount of energy than if you're using natural gas. So that's good, right? Carbon dioxide emissions go down. The problem with this is that natural gas is methane, mostly methane. And methane is 100 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide. And so small emissions of unburned methane to the atmosphere are a huge climatic problem. And increasingly, the problem is associated with shale gas. So what I'm showing you here is the total production of natural gas in the United States from 1980 up until about the present, and projections from the government off into the future. The line there at the top is the total, and then we're breaking it down into conventional natural gas, which was virtually all of our gas through the 20th century and the first few years of this century, and increasingly the shale gas, which is now over 60% of our gas. Tony mentioned this paper that he and I and Renee Santoro put out in 2011. And basically, as the shale gas revolution was taking off, we took on the question, what are the methane emissions associated with shale gas? And no one had really asked that. The assumption is this is a good bridge fuel, who's thinking about methane. We had reasons to believe that the methane emissions might be quite high, and I'm not going to go into the details of our first paper, other than to remind you again that natural gas is mostly methane. So small leaks matter, and we had reason to believe that shale gas was worse than conventional natural gas. And one of our major conclusions, we did the best job we could with the information that was available 5 years ago, but the information was not robust, not well documented. And so we said what really needs to be done is to get better science, more people out there in the field, objective scientists measuring what the emissions from shale gas really are. And that has happened. I'm very proud to say that ours was the first paper, 2011. There are now hundreds of papers on this topic. It's been an explosion of science. And a lot of it's pretty damning. I'm just going to give you one example. This is, I think, the most important example, the scariest example. It's a little complicated, so bear with me. But this is a study published 2 years ago now. They're using satellite data because we can measure methane over the entire atmosphere of the planet from space. And so the upper plot here, we're looking from 2003 to 2012 over time at what the average methane concentration is at any particular area in the circumference of the planet. So North Pole, equator, and South Pole. And the redder colors means that the methane concentrations are going up. Blue's low methane, red's high methane. So the take-home message is that the methane concentrations increased a lot over this last decade or so. And it's mostly in the northern hemisphere. And when the authors of this paper looked in detail to see where this methane was coming from, the answer is it's coming almost entirely from the United States. So the United States is responsible for a huge increase in methane globally over the last decade. And when you look in detail down here, these are the plots, average methane concentrations in the atmosphere on the left there, 2006 to 2008 in the United States before the shale gas revolution, 2009, 2011 when things were first getting going. We don't have more recent data because the satellite's no longer in space, but you can see the colors are getting redder, there's more methane, and it's associated with the shale gas and shale oil regions of the United States. So the shale gas and shale oil revolution of the United States has had a global consequence on the amount of methane in the atmosphere. When we look at what that means in terms of the total greenhouse gas footprint, I'm showing you here both carbon dioxide and methane emissions normalized to their equivalency of carbon dioxide. For coal, diesel oil, conventional natural gas, and shale gas, the orange color is the direct CO2 emissions, the red is what's going on with methane. That's the estimate from the satellite data. There I'm showing you for shale gas. And the take-home message is that shale gas is a climate disaster. It is no bridge fuel whatsoever. And finally, this is perhaps the most important message of this. This is a new study by Jim Hansen, who's one of the world's premier climate scientists. This was published just 5 to 6 weeks ago. Hansen again is showing us here the global trends and total amount of methane in the atmosphere. It increased from the 1980s. It was more or less level for a while, the early part of this century. It's taken off again circa 2008 or so and gone up. And again, that increase is due to shale gas and shale oil development in the United States. Hansen took it further. They modeled the consequences of this on global warming, and their conclusion is the incredible rate of global warming we've seen, particularly over the last few years, which were not predicted by previous models, are largely the result of this increase in methane. So the take-home message is shale gas and shale oil development in the United States is having a demonstrable effect on atmospheric methane, and that is causing the incredible rate of global warming we're seeing. The solution to slowing that rate of warming is to get rid of shale gas. So I'm going to finish with my part there. Again, methane is critical to reaching the targets that the nations of the world wisely set in Paris. I think New Yorkers need to wake up. We've banned shale gas, but we've banned fracking to produce our own, but we are importing shale gas, and you'll hear more about that. And we need to take responsibility for that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Keith, who'll give you the details. Thank you.
So, good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk to you about what's actually happening here in the great state of New York. Okay, you have heard the hype. You've heard you've seen the promotional materials. You've probably heard the speeches. What is going on here in the state of New York to deal with our energy issue? If you talk to the guy in the middle there, Governor Cuomo, he'll tell you we are leading the way on climate change. He will tell you that there is groundbreaking activity going on today to address our climate issues. We have to tell you that the most groundbreaking activity that's actually occurring in the state of New York is the shattering of bedrock in Pennsylvania to fuel New York's growing addiction to gas. In the last 10 years, we've seen a massive growth in New York's use of shale gas for all purposes. And this picture displays it right here. The total use of gas in New York is up 18% in just 5 years, and that number is still growing. The number of gas customers, for people who use heating and so forth, has gone up dramatically. 500,000 customers have signed up in New York to be on gas in just the last 10 years. And by the way, that's more than the change for the entire rest of the country put together. So yeah, we're leading the way, but we're leading the way toward more gas. That's the problem. Use of natural gas for electricity has nearly doubled in 10 years. Here's the statistics that show that. And it shows up with things that are being constructed as we speak. The CPV power plant under construction. If that gets built, it's going to be pushing an additional 2 million tons of carbon dioxide into the air. When you add methane into the equation, you can double or triple that number. This is a graph that basically tells you where we stand in terms of our electricity generation. Natural gas is winning by far. Look at the two reds, natural gas and renewables. We've got a long way to go on renewables. This is the reality of what's happening here in the state of New York. And it's not just what's happening now, it is what's proposed to happen in the future. This is a graph that comes from information from the New York Independent System Operator. What this is telling you is that in the queue for NYISO right now, more than half of all new proposed generation is gas, or dual fuel, which is actually gas with oil backup, basically. And when you look at this picture, it's even worse than this. And that's because you've heard the phrase, the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. Well, that's actually true. And what that means is that if these power plants are built, their ability to produce electricity around the clock is much greater than renewables. So that's actually a pretty scary scenario we're talking about. And it's not just the big power plants, it's small ones too. Reforming the energy vision, you've heard about reforming the energy vision rev. There's a great push for distributed generation. And distributed generation can be a good thing. That's what renewables can thrive in. But guess what? Gas competes really well in a distributed generation environment as well. And that's particularly scary when our state has policies and programs that actually encourage distributed generation without respect to where it's coming from. So what we're actually seeing is a transformation of our energy system away from centralized generation to distributed, but a lot of it is gas. So power plants, 20 megawatt facility you're looking at right there. Below here is a pack of micro turbines. This would be potentially used in like an office or a commercial setting. Anyway, this is all moving in the wrong direction. And if you look at vehicles, same thing. Compressed natural gas, we have 120 compressed natural gas CNG vehicle fueling stations in the country, in the state, and that number continues to grow. And so you're seeing this as well in the vehicle part of it. And this graph is particularly useful, I think, because it's telling you that we're burning more gas to move gas. This is an indication of the gas being burned within distribution systems and pipeline systems. This is compressor stations. This is the gas being burned in compressor stations to move more gas down the pipeline. And you can see that's accelerating. It's accelerating because we're building more pipelines and we're pushing more gas through them. Dominion is an example of that. So you might ask, well, Keith, what are you possibly talking about? I mean, the state has a great plan. We've heard all about the plan. There's a clean energy standard. It just came out a few months ago, and that's supposed to get us to 50% renewables by 2030. Doesn't that solve this problem? It doesn't. This is the situation. Today, let's look at our existing electricity portfolio. 26% renewables. By the way, almost all of that is hydropower that's been with us for decades. Okay. Nuclear, fossil fuels. This is where the carbon footprint is, right over here in orange. How is New York going to meet that 50% by 2030 goal? Well, that's what we got today. This is the other half of this pie that has to become green if we're going to go renewables for 50%. Well, the state's doing good things, right? Like there's a program called New York Sun. It's a 3,000 megawatt program. That should do a lot for us, right? Well, it does a little bit. Okay. What about the offshore wind wind farm that's being now talked about, and the governor's even talking about it? 700 megawatts. That's about 145 megawatt turbines. Well, that gets you that far. The point is, we got a long way to go, and we're not seeing the evidence that activity is occurring to fill out this pie. What's it actually going to take? A lot more than 140 wind turbines offshore of New York City. How about 2,000, almost 2,000? How many do we have right now? 0. Let's talk about onshore wind, because there have been some onshore wind farms that have been built. Well, we had a good surge of activity over here in 2007, 2008, but then it slacked off, and it's plateaued, and it's flatlined for the last 3 years. So this is the reality of what's happening in New York State right now. We're not going in the direction we need to be. So the bottom line is, how does this relate to our goals? How does this relate to actually tackling the climate problem? What does this mean in terms of our greenhouse gas reduction objectives? The state's goal is to get to 80% reduction in total greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And the state energy plan says that we should get half of that by 2030, coming out of the energy sector. Well, you remember everything I showed you about that pie, okay, with fossil fuels and nuclear and renewables? That was all electricity. The reality is electricity is only a small piece, or one piece, of our entire carbon footprint. Also on-site combustion. You know, I wasn't cold last night because I had the heat on in my house. That's fossil fuels being burned. Probably all of us were doing that. I think all of us got here by a car. So this is where the largest percentage of our carbon footprint is. It is in these other things. And what's happening here? The CES doesn't deal with that. The CES dealt with just electricity. And by the way, the impact of the CES was about that much. Okay? So we have a long way to go. It's not clear that the CES is going to get us there. And the real question is, what other things are happening in these arenas to achieve what needs to be done? And here's another clincher to be aware of. To solve these problems, to deal with on-site combustion, to get away from burning fossil fuels to heat your homes, to get into electric vehicles, these things require conversion to systems that actually will require more electricity. So that piece of the pie has got to get bigger. And if we're going to make a dent in climate change, it can't be fossil fuels that produces that additional electricity. It's got to be renewables. So the problem is none of that was considered in the Clean Energy Standard. It was just looking at our existing electricity, doing some projections based on typical forecasts, and what it takes to move these other sectors of our carbon footprint away from fossil fuels wasn't part of the equation. So ultimately, if we're going to succeed, a lot of these other areas have to be whited out too by 2030 and ultimately by 2050. And by the way, you know, what I showed you here was the carbon footprint of fossil fuel combustion. Okay, it's CO2. Add this to it too. Methane, everything Bob told you was telling you about. This is the picture we're facing. So it's kind of sobering. So the question becomes, what actually can be done? And the good news is that there was a paper produced by the two gentlemen that are here with me, and several other scientists that looked into the feasibility of actually getting us off of fossil fuels entirely. This is what it's going to take. Okay. Now the state's goal is to 80% reduction, so it's not 100% reduction. But that means you're going to need about 80% of this stuff, okay? So when I was talking about 2,000 wind turbines to fill out the CES, scratch that. It's more like 16,000 if we're really trying to deal with fossil fuels across the board. So bottom line is, we need a major course correction. We have to step up to reality. We need to see what's actually happening and what's not happening, own up to it, and make some major changes. First of all, let's not make things worse. We need to abandon the flawed policies and programs that are out there, policies that currently promote gas for heating and vehicles and encourage folks to convert to gas. That's a mistake. And to promote distributed generation without respect to where that energy is coming from. Distributed generation from renewables is great. Distributed generation from gas is not. We need to stop approving more gas-fired power plants and infrastructure. And we need to develop a plan, a genuine plan, to phase out existing fossil fuel power plants and to phase out the end-use consumption of fossil fuels for heating and transportation, the stuff I was talking about. Synchronous with that, and the word synchronicity is pretty important here because you got to plan for the downscaling of fossil fuels as you plan for the ramping up of renewables. We need a plan to get those renewables on scale and on time so that we can meet our energy needs. That means deploying renewables for wind, water, sun, coming up with the storage and grid enhancements that is going to take to address this, to make room for the additional electricity that we're talking about, like I said a moment ago. And then to install to have electric vehicles, install the high efficiency heat pumps so that we can actually get off of fossil fuels. So the bottom line is the good news is New York actually has ample wind, water, and solar resources, probably better than any other state. That's the good news. But to maximize that potential requires a technically feasible plan, ample public investment, and a commitment by leaders, political leaders and agencies at every level of government. The bottom line is that banning high-volume fracking within New York's borders while encouraging elsewhere won't solve the climate problem. We feel that Governor Cuomo can truly lead in the fight against climate change if we end New York's addiction to fossil fuels, including and especially shale gas, and if the governor calls for a real plan that can meet our climate goals. Thank you.
Briefly summarized, we were supposed to be decreasing our demand for fossil fuels and increasing our supply of renewables. What you just heard is that we're going in the exact opposite direction on both ways. We're going the wrong way down a one-way street. You know what happens when that happens. So, but I don't want to end on that negative note. You also heard that New York has ample resources to do a complete transition to renewable energy in our lifetimes, everybody in this room, including me. And it just takes a little bit more political will and a little bit more concern from Wall Street. And I should add one thing that hasn't come up. less resistance from us. There's far too much resistance across New York State from the very same people who said no shale gas in my backyard are now saying no solar panels and no wind in my backyard. You can't have it both ways. Suck it up and be courageous. So with that, I want to open up for Q&A and ask the question. We will repeat the question so it's recorded, and I'll direct the question to the appropriate answerer. Who's first?
The cost, if you look at the plan that we put forward, the Jacobson et al. Plan for 2030, fossil fuel-free New York, the price tag of that is substantial, but the price we're paying now for use of fossil fuels in terms of the externalities is also amazing. This state spends tens of billions of dollars every year in healthcare costs and in premature deaths from people who are exposed to air pollution from using fossil fuels. And our plan showed that over a 20-year time period, the cost of going completely fossil-free is actually less than what we're now spending just on those healthcare costs. Forget the climate change costs and forget what we're actually paying for fossil fuels. So it's a substantial amount of money, but it makes economic sense to go ahead and do it. And it's going to make increasingly economic sense. At the moment, wind is cost competitive with many types of fossil fuels for new power plant construction. That will only become increasingly so as we move forward. And if we make the step now, and in 10 or 20 years, we are leaders in a fossil fuel-free world, then we'll have energy security here. We will have energy stability and pricing, which should be good for businesses. It creates a massive amount of jobs, or more than 3 times as many jobs per dollar invested in renewable energy technologies than in fossil fuel industries. So it's actually good for the economy. We just need to get on with it.
It's going to be hard to repeat both those questions, but the first part essentially was, are there any other states doing anything significant against the use of shale gas, shale oil? And the second part is, what do we think is going to happen going forward in the regulatory arena, given the tone of the appointments that are being proposed for the key federal agencies? So I'll take a stab at both of those. And then, so New York State is a leader. We're the only state in the country with significant shale gas resources that have said no. There are other states that have said no, but they don't have significant resources. So yeah, whoopee. But you just heard that we said no shale gas development in New York, but we're sucking up shale gas in Pennsylvania at a greater rate than ever seen before. So we can't say, wow, look at the states following us. Not yet. We haven't exhibited that kind of leadership. We're being hypocritical. On the second part, yeah, you're absolutely...
But just to answer, for a clear answer,
yeah.
Are there any states that have banned the use of shale gas?
Yeah, Vermont. I tried to say Vermont does not have any shale gas, does not have any shale oil, so it's a nominal banning.
They banned drilling. Have they also banned its use in energy
No.
production?
No.
Okay, that's my question.
Okay, no state, not even New York, has banned the use, the actual burning or emission of shale gas. Not even New York, no. Second part, you're absolutely correct. We should probably anticipate that over the next 4 years, those federal agencies that we have come to rely on for regulatory protection are not going to be reliable. And what does that tell you? Great, we're a federal country. We're not we have 50 states that can do their own thing. And what we're here telling you is that New York State should do its own thing. We can't rely on the EPA to protect us anymore. We have to rely on the DEC to protect us. We have to rely on the Department of Health to protect us. We have to rely on the governor to protect us, not the president.
Again, on jobs, there are more jobs in renewable energy than in fossil fuels by a long way. So
what about being, just useless for, cleaning up the climate? Other countries are going to do what they want.
Well, other countries are doing what they want. I think China is showing some real climate leadership, quite frankly. They are stepping up. They are challenging the U.S. to stay with the COP21 agreements. They are international leaders in their rate of growth of sustainable energy. And so, my fear, quite frankly, is that China will show huge leadership and become the central country doing it right, and the United States will become a backwater. But I think we have a chance here in New York State and in California to show an alternative model for our country. Our economy here in New York is major. Our economy in California is major. You know, if you deconvolute the economy of the United States, we're the 5th and 8th largest economies in the world, respectively, in these two states. If these states show leadership and push ahead, it'll make a big difference. And other states, I am convinced, will see that it is good for their economy. It's good for their citizens. It's good for jobs. It's good for energy pricing and business and energy security. So I think we should push ahead, set an example, and I honestly believe that it'll be possible to still meet the COP21 accords despite the incredible affairs that are going to be seen in Washington.
Everybody heard that question? Is the disconnect that appears to exist within the higher levels of Albany real? Absolutely. That's one of the reasons we're having this press conference. It's one of the reasons I said that the politicians aren't listening to the scientists. Basil Sagos is correct. And what you heard today puts a lie to the comment from the other person at PSC that says shale gas is a clean fossil fuel. No, it's not.
Can I just
We're all educators here, but we're not used to educating people in Albany, but that's what we're here to do. Go ahead, Bob.
Just keep in mind how recent this science is. I mean, literally, the paper that Tony and I put out 5 years ago, no one was paying attention to this idea of methane being important in the greenhouse gas footprint of shale gas at that point in time. A lot of people challenged our work and questioned it early on too. I mean, at this point, I think there's a strong consensus behind what I've said. Those satellite data I showed you are real. Those were published only 2 years ago. You know, it takes a while for this sort of information to completely get through the bureaucracy and various administrative levels, particularly when there's, you know, discordant information coming from other sources. But the science is becoming quite strong, and as it becomes so, I'm again confident that the officials of this state will begin to speak more with one voice. I hope so.
Let me add one. I'd like to add one more thing there. You've all heard the phrase putting lipstick on a pig. It's relevant for your particular question. When you're faced with an issue where you can't do what you want to do, which is turn a switch on 1,700 offshore wind turbines and thousands of acres of solar panels that we don't have, then the only game you have to play is natural gas. So you're going to put lipstick on that pig and say it's clean. But it's not. The point is that we didn't have a plan in place 10 years ago. We didn't have a plan in place 5 years ago. We don't have a plan in place right now that would meet the synchronicity demands that Keith talked about. As we're decreasing our use of natural gas and coal, we have to be increasing the availability of renewables, and that brings into question the other question you asked about where's the money going to come from. Wall Street is waking up. Wall Street is waking up.
When you hear agencies talk about gas as being a clean fuel, well, it's not. So those are complete inaccurate statements that are taking us in the wrong direction. In terms of the things that are happening, like the Clean Energy Standard, you know, within the small box that it defined for itself, it arguably could achieve things with a lot of work, but the small box doesn't address the big picture. The big picture, like I was pointing out, is electricity is about a quarter of our total carbon footprint. We need to tackle the other things too. What Tony just said about the need to have a serious plan that actually gets you off of fossil fuels. That means synchronicity between ramping up on renewables as you're scaling down on fossil fuels. We don't see that in the plan as currently proposed. So ultimately, if you're going to do something bold, if you're like getting rid of all fossil fuels, like getting to zero emissions, which is what the proposed bill purports to do, there's a lot of work to accomplish that. That needs to be articulated in the bill. So we don't see that yet.
I'll add just a couple more comments to Keith's on the CCPA. The intent of the bill is laudable. Anybody with a soul who reads the first couple pages of that bill has tears in their eyes. We're talking Hamilton here. We're talking, this is America. But when you get into the technical details, as Keith points out, we found a couple of problems with it, and we're trying to address those problems. And the key issue is, and we've said this a couple of times already today, politicians in Albany don't understand yet, haven't been educated yet on the scope of energy in New York State. We're lauding the first 100 and so offshore wind turbines. Well, we need 100 more like that between now and 2030. Where's the plan? How do we know when that's going? How do we know when the confluence of Wall Street capital, community acceptance, and political will are going to combine to allow that 100 times what we don't yet have to occur in time to meet the climate problem? So, yeah, we'd like to see the CCPA make it this time, but we'd like to see modifications to it on the technical side. All the rest of it is beautiful.
The question is New York moving fast enough with the planning? And we're not aware of anything at the scale that's required, is the bottom line. So yes, it's a step in the right direction. The Jacobson et al. Plan that we put out called for roughly half of the total energy in the future of the state coming from offshore wind. You know, where it's the biggest resource we have in this state that's easiest to get, and so we really need to push ahead with it. And the state is starting to move slowly in that direction, but it really needs to do a lot more, and a lot more quickly.
Yeah, and you know, I think it's important to recognize that when you're talking about setting goals and possibly meeting goals or possibly not meeting goals, the consequences of not meeting your goals is not just that, you know, you didn't get the number you wanted. It means we're going to be burning more gas. That's the consequence of not stepping up to the plate and doing what needs to be done.
We spent hundreds of millions of dollars in 5 years on that EPA study, and it's a beautiful study of the wrong problem. Fracking's not the problem. It's everything that comes before fracking and after fracking, like we talked about today. That report has not a single word in it that addresses anything we spoke about today. Totally irrelevant, orthogonal, as an engineer would say. So 5 years, great effort, wonderful people working on it. And the conclusion is what we knew at the very beginning. There's a very small likelihood that fracking per se, that few hours when a gas well or oil well is actually fracked, is going to have a significant impact on human health. It does not address anything that comes before or afterwards, all of which has profound effect on human health.
Is the EPA working on a methane study?
The EPA, which EPA? the outgoing EPA has proposed new methane rules and has proposed a clean power plan, which obviously has impact in the methane arena. The likelihood that either those rules or that clean power plan are ever going to see real enforcement at this point in the next 4 years, very low.
Just one comment on what EPA has done to date, because they have tried to put regulations forward to deal better with the methane, and I could nitpick it around the edges, but fundamentally the regulations are based on industry self-reporting, and I do not accept that as a reliable way to do this. The industry has no real incentive to be truthful, quite frankly, and so we need a much more robust regulatory structure for this whole industry.
The question is, have technical experts been sought in crafting the bill? Am I right?
Yes.
And in our view, that still needs to happen. So there was a statement about self-reporting that actually is at issue with the bill you're talking about as well. One of the things that we've been saying is that to get a handle on what emissions are, to measure progress, you need to keep track of it with a robust annual assessment that looks at the whole gamut of things. Self-reporting, you know, you could argue that that could be a one piece of what informs your analysis of what our emissions are on an annual basis, but it can't be the only piece. It certainly needs to be verified. And there's scientific research that has to go into, you know, field analysis of what leakage actually occurs in the pipeline systems, not just generally in the country, but here in New York State. That kind of analysis needs to go into a robust report to really get a handle on what our greenhouse gas emissions are. If you want, there's actually a slide I could jump back to that I think is relevant. We had a couple extra slides if people ask good questions like you are. The state has a greenhouse gas inventory report that comes out with every 4 years. We have some real concerns about what it says, because it basically says that the state already has made great progress, that we've already reduced greenhouse gas emissions 12% since 1990, and it's because we've switched from coal to gas. That's what it says. Well, there was a field analysis that was actually taken a couple years ago, where measurements were taken from a vehicle that drove around Manhattan. This is what it shows. It shows huge spikes. These are methane spikes. The higher the pillar, the higher the amount of emissions from these different sites going around Manhattan. What they determined when they looked at the data was that you have 8.6 billion cubic feet of methane per year coming out of Manhattan, leaking. This is leakage, methane. This is not combustion. That translates to about 4.4 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. That's huge. Well, compare that to what NYSERDA says. NYSERDA's greenhouse gas inventory says that it's 3.5 million metric tons of CO2e.
For the entire state.
For the whole state. So, there's a big problem here. That's what NYSERDA thinks is coming out of the entire state, when we know more than that's coming out of Manhattan by itself. And guess what? That number is assuming 25 as the global warming potential for gas, because we're comparing it to what NYSERDA used, which was 25, which is incorrect. We now know it's 34 over 100 years, 86 over 20 years. When you actually do it correctly, you find out that 8.6 billion cubic feet of methane per year translates to, over a 20-year time frame, a carbon impact, a global warming impact of 15 million metric tons of CO2e. It's a pretty big difference between that number for Manhattan and that number that the state's owning up to for the whole state of New York. So yeah, we think there are problems with the way the state is inventorying gas. The question was, is NYSERDA using the wrong numbers and coming up with their analysis of gas emissions, right? Yes, they are. The report I was referring to, if you go to the back page, you look up the table of what they use as their references. 25. We've known for several years now. It's not 25. The other thing that the state is doing is they're not really doing a true inventory of methane in New York. If you look at the report, they've done one thing only. They've basically taken the EPA numbers, which we know are wrong, for gas leakage nationwide, and then they said, okay, well, we'll estimate what the state's leakage is by simply taking the ratio of how much gas we use in New York to the amount of gas that the whole country uses. We'll multiply that by the EPA's number for leakage rates, and we'll say that's how much methane is coming out of New York State. It's not based on any actual data from New York State.
The question is, in the state, in relying on EPA's approach, are they underestimating the methane leakages, and are they underestimating how we account for methane relative to carbon dioxide? And the answer is yes, they are severely on the wrong side of both. EPA is and the state is. And there are two factors. One's the average methane emissions nationwide. Keith is correct, we don't have good detailed statistics for the state. We do have estimates for the entire country. The strong consensus of all of the scientific literature on this over the last 3 to 4 years is that the EPA estimates are at least twofold too low, maybe threefold too low in terms of the amount of methane being leaked. Then, how do we compare methane and carbon dioxide? And we use this thing called the global warming potential. Basically, methane, when it's in the atmosphere, is 105 times more potent than carbon dioxide. But methane stays in the air for only 12 years. Carbon dioxide will stay in the air for centuries. So you need to compare them over some time frame. If you pick a 100-year time frame, it greatly discounts the problem of methane at shorter time periods. And again, Jim Hansen is telling us that the unprecedented warming we're seeing over the last few years is because of methane. If you average that 100 years into the future, it doesn't look like a big deal, but it is a big deal. So a lot of us are saying we should use a shorter time period. On top of that, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is sort of the international scientific consensus building behind this, are the ones who produce these numbers. Even at the 100-year time period, they've been telling us since 2013 that that number is too low. And EPA has simply, and the state, have simply refused to come up to date with the science. That number is about 15 years old.
We've been asked to bring back the graph produced by Drew Shindell and his colleagues at NASA. And you have a question about how we should use this graph to emphasize the time issue?
The point is that as we look into the future of warming here, if we do nothing with greenhouse gas emissions, we're on that trajectory. If we reduce carbon dioxide emissions but ignore methane, we're on that trajectory, because there are 30-year lags in how the climate responds to carbon dioxide. We need to reduce carbon dioxide because we need to start pulling that down.
When are those tipping points?
But the only way to keep on these trajectories is to control methane. This is if you do methane and soot alone. This is if you do methane, soot, and carbon dioxide, which is what we want to do. So if we reduce methane emissions, we can slow the rate of global warming now. We buy decades of time before we start to hit these tipping points, right? We cannot do it with CO2 alone. The time frame over which we're going to meet this tipping point if we do nothing is 6 to 10 years. When we compare CO2 and methane over a 100-year time period, we're averaging that effect way out to here, which is extremely misleading.
So the question is, given the comparisons among shale gas, coal, petroleum, it appears that shale gas is a loser, but coal is a winner. So why not just switch back to coal?
And the answer is that we need to get rid of shale gas because of the short-term methane need, and we need to slow the warming immediately. But that carbon dioxide is more than from shale gas. And the carbon dioxide, any of this carbon dioxide that we produce now, will be influencing the climate for at least 1,000 years into the future. So it'd be irresponsible to say, oh, let's encourage this because it's better short term than that. We need to damp down on both as quickly as we can. But this whole idea that this is horrible because of CO2, so the bridge is okay, is just dead wrong. And it is what's leading to the accelerated warming we're seeing.
The question is, are we calling for a ban on the use of shale gas in New York State? Yeah, I am.
Yes, we are. But keep in mind that the shale gas, that the gas which comes to New York State is all shale gas because of our proximity to it and the way the pipeline structures work. So we need to get rid of all natural gas if we're going to get rid of shale gas.
And let me, that was an emotional outburst. On a more rational level, on a more rational level, ban has this this immediately, stop it. No. What we've been saying is we have to manage two problems simultaneously. This word synchronicity. You manage the decrease in the use of fossil fuels, especially shale gas. By manage, I mean politically, economically, and by our own individual demands. At the same time, you're managing the increase in deployment of renewable energy. That's a rational approach to doing things. That's the basis for a plan. It has two parts. Drop this over some time, increase this over some time, remembering that the time that we have to do it is about a decade. Okay, thank you for that memory test for a 69-year-old. So the first question was very specific. I'm going to flunk this test. The first question was very specific, having to do with what about the issue of storage for renewable energy? You know, the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time, so how do you store energy when it's being created from a renewable source so that you can use it when it's not available? The second question was the general question of how about this disconnect between what science is saying about climate change and what some politicians and a very large segment of a certain part of the population is saying about climate change. Isn't that leading us into some sort of dissonance on a societal level? Those are the questions. Who wants to do the first one? I passed the test for remembering the questions. Somebody has to answer them.
Storage is an important part of the energy future because the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. But load management, smart grids are a big part of that. Accurate forecasts of the wind domain and the weather so you know exactly what you're going to get for solar and wind and use it optimally. As we use more and more electric cars, the average electric car is actually only using about 15% of its battery charge per day in driving, and so there's a huge capacity of surplus batteries there. If we have two-way communication through a smart grids, there's some studies showing that's a significant amount of storage. There are other ways to store electricity, including electrolysis.
Pump storage, flywheels.
Yeah, flywheels, pump storage, compressed air. And the Jacobson plan was based entirely on technologies that were commercially available as of 4 years ago. And so, you know, the technologies are going to get better and better, and they'll make it cheaper and cheaper, and that's good, but we don't have to wait. And the analogy I like to make is, you know, in this country, we went from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles as a major mode of transportation. We did that in about 15 to 20 years, you know, back in the early 20th century. And the first cars looked like horse-drawn carriages. They still had reins for steering. They got rid of the horses. They had pulleys, and the brakes were a lever you pulled against it. We didn't wait for rack and pinion steering and disc brakes to build the automobile. We started the transition, and then the technologies improved. And that is what we need to do for this energy revolution. Second part of your question, it is extremely depressing to be a climate scientist. I have worked on climate science since the 1970s. My first major job after I got my PhD was to teach a climate change course with Harvard, Princeton, Yale, MIT, and Woods Hole. That was back in 1980. Our greenhouse impact on the planet has doubled in the time I've been teaching it, so I'm clearly not a very effective teacher. And yeah, it's I don't have optimism. I will tell you that the climate denial movement is a recent thing. You know, back in the 1990s, Republicans believed in climate change much more than they do now, and it's an American phenomenon. You know, I travel a lot, and people in the rest of the world, everyone believes in climate change. So it's a U.S. phenomenon, it's a manufactured phenomenon, and yes, it's extremely distressing, at least to me.
Yeah, on the storage issue, I'm not sure it was mentioned, that when you're making that transition, hopefully to 100% fossil fuel free, it's when you're approaching that 50% mark, you can do a lot with the load sharing, the load management that Bob was talking about. After you hit 50% and you want more renewables than that, then that's where the storage really kicks in as something you need to have. But you can do a lot actually with the load management that Bob was talking about. So anyway, I just want to bring that up.
Yeah, and one more thing about the storing the energy. You don't have to store the energy if the wind isn't blowing on Long Island, but the wind is blowing up in the northwestern part of the state or in the northern part of the state, as long as you have a grid that will efficiently take that energy from where it's being produced to where it's not being produced. We haven't figured out how to stretch New York State so the sun is always shining in it, but we're working on it. Yeah. So the question is, what role do we think nuclear energy should play in New York's future, and what do we think of the recently announced subsidy to keep some of the nuclear power plants currently operating in New York State operating for some time in the future? Oh boy.
Go for it.
Okay, so I'm formulating that the issue of having a plan is important here. So I'm going to take a chance. I know I'm going to regret this, of using an example of not having a plan. There it is. There's the example. There are many people in New York State that would have liked to have those nuclear power plants shut down as soon as possible. Not turned off tonight, but as soon as possible. And if we do that, people are going to freeze in the dark because we don't have the renewable energy ready to deploy to replace the electricity coming from those plants. Well, why didn't we? Poor planning on our part 10 years ago. Poor planning on, okay, if we had implemented the Jacobson plan in 2012, we might have been able to shut one of those plants down by now. We might have had enough wind energy, we might have had enough solar energy in order for us to shut down one or more of those plants. But here's an example of poor planning leads to less than ideal compromises, where in this case $7 billion of ratepayer and taxpayers' dollars are going to be paying for shareholders dividends. That's the money exchange that's going to occur. And our leadership, our economic and political leadership, allowed that to happen because they weren't willing to face the music 10 years ago and say, let's have a plan so we can shut those plants down. All right, map that into the future. What's the next thing that's going to happen? We're going to have to shut the plants down sometime in the near future. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, are we going to repeat this by saying, all right, we still don't have enough offshore wind turbines, onshore wind turbines, and acres and thousands of acres of solar panels, so let's build some more CPVs all around the state. Did we learn our lesson? rhetorical question.
Yeah, so I think the question was if you with the optimism that's happening about making some changes, and the potential for making changes, does it really matter when a lot of this gas is being exported? That's kind of and how do we factor that into this?
Well, how do we address the export? It
Right.
does matter that we make the changes to renewable.
Right. I think it's important that we don't oversimplify the situation. The fact is, exports are a piece of it. That is part of the driving, the economic aspect of it. The companies want to make more money because they can sell overseas. By the way, once they deplete our resources here, they'll be happy to reverse those pipelines and import gas again. We'll be dependent on foreign fuel again when we frack the rest of the world. That's obviously that's I hear what you're saying, but a lot of the use of gas that's driving this is also domestic. I mean, the pictures that I showed, the graphs of the consumption in New York State, also in the Northeast. The main pipeline is being sent to new power plants that are being built up the line, right, in New England. So we're part of the problem. We are part of the problem.
Just as part of the export issue, I was in Brussels earlier in the fall. As there's a large interest in Europe in natural gas. They also are expanding their use of natural gas. There's a big interest in using less Russian gas and getting it more from elsewhere. And so there's an interest in importing fracked gas from the U.S. There's an interest in getting fracked gas from Morocco, et cetera. And there are dozens and dozens of organizations and hundreds of activists who are concerned about that. So they had a summit to try and figure out what to do about it. In Europe, the argument that they're hearing from industry is that the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, so we need natural gas as a backup. And of course, that's false. It's plain, simple false. So the activists are trying to get that messaging through, and I think we should try and give them our support. But if the markets to which we export dry up, which they should, then that helps solve the problem too.
Two parts to that question. One, do we agree that we're an awesome team?
I don't know.
Pretty awesome.
That was the easy one. And then the second part of the question is...
Does it make any difference?
Does it make, yeah. Well put. Do we have optimism that our messaging, not just what we said today, but what we've said in the things that we've written for the last 4 or 5 years and all the talks that we give all across the state, do we have an optimism that the message is having an effect, not only between agencies, but within agencies in the government, including all the ones you mentioned? Well, we made this a press conference because we wanted the press to hear the message, because we thought that the press would get the message out where people in those agencies would read it, because we know that people in those agencies do not come to our talks. Yeah, darn. So am I optimistic that we're getting through? Yeah, I have to be. Otherwise, there's no reason to keep on doing it. We're getting through, but does that mean that our message being heard will have an implementable effect? Will DEC, DOH, PSC, NYSERDA do things resulting from the research that we do? We hope so. I'm optimistic. Keith, go ahead, Keith.
I just want to say that, that's why we put the hard reality up here. Because ultimately, if we're going to be making progress and accomplishing something here, all of us, activists, agencies, we need to own up to what it's actually going to take. Okay, so we showed you some really hard numbers to swallow, but that's what we need to be talking about, because that's what it's going to take to accomplish this, and so it's going to be important for all of us to understand that as we advocate for doing the right thing.
Yeah, could the three of us write Governor Cuomo's next State of the Union address? Or the part of that State of the Union address that has to do with climate change and energy in New York State? Yeah, we could write it. We could send it to him. Would he read it?
Give it a try.
Yeah, we'll give it a try. So do legislators in New York State, the people who actually write and vote on the bills, reach out to people like us and ask for consultation? or even farther than that, ask for advocacy. Some do, in my opinion. From my experience, some do. Most don't.
Some definitely do. And there's no point in naming specifics now, but there are some good legislative leaders, I would say, who do try and make sure the science is right, do reach out to people like us. And there's some events that I think are encouraging. I mean, just over a year ago, Assemblyman Engelbright, who chairs the Assembly's, what do they call it, Roundtable on Climate, invited me and a handful of other experts to come and talk to him and 6 other Assembly people, and we spent 5 hours. I mean, I drove from Ithaca thinking I was in for a half-hour blip because he's a busy guy, but no, he was interested, and I think there are other people truly interested. So that's part of what gives me some optimism.
The question is, in the calculations in the graphs and charts that we've shown where we're trying to quantify leakage rates for methane, does it include everything, the whole life, what we call the whole life cycle, from the time the first bulldozer shows up to create a pad to the time the gas either gets vented or burned? And the answer is yes, as best we can. Bob, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a little. Yes, it certainly does. So, say in this figure, it includes the emissions all the way from the well site to final consumer. And so this is a way you can view, if you are using those fuels, this is your impact on the planet. So it doesn't have a geographic specificity, it's specific to the consumption.
The question is, what do we say to those who say that the industry does everything it can to reduce inadvertent leakage and purposeful venting because it's in their best economic interest to do so? Again, my emotional outburst is that's BS. Okay, in the best of times, when natural gas was selling for $14 per 1,000 cubic feet, an argument could be made that for every 1,000 cubic feet that you don't vent or you don't leak, there's a potential for $14 of sales. Well, last time I looked, the price of natural gas is about $3, and the regulatory impetus has diminished nationwide, including in Pennsylvania and New York State, and no less than senior vice presidents of major oil and gas companies have testified before the Congress of the United States on this exact issue. Okay, a senator, I can't remember his name, someone from the New England states asked the vice president of Southwestern Energy, "Why are you leaking all this gas? Why are you venting all that gas? It's a valuable commodity." And his answer was, well, in a time of tight monetary conditions, you have to choose where you're going to spend each dollar. And if we're going to spend a dollar putting new equipment on a site, or putting new controls on a site, or putting new personnel going out finding and fixing leakage, or put that extra dollar into drilling another well. That was the answer he gave in the Congress of the United States. So there it is from the horse's mouth. So that's no, I don't believe for a moment, as some NGOs have been saying for years, that with just a little bit of twisting of the arm, we can get the entire oil and gas industry to tighten up millions of leaks across a very complex system ranging from well sites all the way to end users, merely for economic reasons. They should be doing it for life support reasons. They should be doing it for their kids.
And I would just add, this touches upon the subject of externalized costs. The fact that the way the economy is structured is that those costs that we all bear, health costs and so forth, aren't factored into the decision making of corporations that are doing this drilling. They're deciding it's in their profit interest to let the methane leak, especially when you're talking about $3. So somehow, I think part of the solution has got to be a way of internalizing those externalized costs, and so that the cost of fuel does end up reflecting the burden it puts on society.
So we collectively want to thank you all, especially those of you who helped arrange this press conference and all of you who have attended. It's been you've been a great audience, asking all the right questions. So go out and do good. Thank you.
Thank you.